The old cook at the Maple Diner, a woman named Rose, often said that in her 30 years of serving tables across Illinois, she had never seen a wealthy man humiliate a poor woman with such calculated coldness, all over a folded piece of paper. To understand why a billionaire would write $0 on a tip line and leave a single meant to shatter a single mother's heart, you have to start at the very beginning. You have to know Lucy Miller. Lucy was 28 years old, though the permanent exhaustion shadowing her bright green eyes easily added another 10 years to her face. She kept her brown hair pulled back in a messy bun that always unraveled halfway through her double shifts, wearing a light blue uniform with white trim that had been meticulously mended at the elbows 3 times. By 5 o'clock in the morning, she was already on her feet, preparing for a day that would test every ounce of her endurance. By 6 o'clock, she would drop off her 6-year-old son, Matthew, at the home of Carol, the kind elderly neighbor who watched him in exchange for a few dollars, and whatever leftover food Lucy managed to salvage at the end of the night. By 6:30, Lucy pushed through the glass doors of the Maple Diner, tied her faded apron, and began a grueling shift that rarely ended before midnight. The diner was a classic American roadside staple, featuring large windows that invited the morning sun, worn red leather booths, a black and white checkered floor, and a long chrome counter that Lucy polished every single morning until she could see her own tired reflection. The air always smelled of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and toasted bread. For most travelers, it was merely a quick pit stop on Route 66. But for Lucy, it was the only fortress separating her fragile family from absolute homelessness. That particular Thursday morning, she had accepted yet another double shift, not out of desire, but because the hospital bills sitting on a kitchen counter remained unpaid, and because little Matthew had woken up with a severe fever once again. Carol had mentioned that the boy had been coughing violently all night, gently advising Lucy that the child needed a real doctor, not just cheap pharmacy syrup. Lucy had swallowed the massive lump in her throat and promised she would take him as soon as she got paid that week, a promise she desperately made and broke every single month because something always intervened. The rent, the electricity, the boy's worn-out shoes, or the mounting shadow of old debts always consumed her meager earnings before she could save a dime. The boy's father had walked out on them before Matthew could even say his first words, leaving Lucy completely alone, without family support, without savings, and with nothing but her exhausted body and an unbroken, quiet pride. It was not a boastful pride, but rather the silent, resilient dignity of a woman who, despite having everything stacked against her, never once stopped smiling warmly at her customers. She never served a plate of food without wishing them a wonderful meal, and she absolutely refused to let her personal misery poison her professional demeanor. That afternoon, the diner was relatively peaceful, trapped in the quiet lull between the busy lunch rush and the chaotic dinner service, allowing Lucy a rare moment to refill the sugar dispensers and napkin holders. Then, the bell above the door chimed softly, signaling the arrival of a man who was clearly not an ordinary roadside customer. She knew it instantly, just as every seasoned waitress knows when a stranger from an entirely different universe crosses the threshold. The man wore a custom-tailored black suit that likely cost more than an average family car, paired with a crisp white shirt left open at the collar without a tie, projecting the effortless aura of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his sharp face, tense jawline, and cold eyes projecting an intense, distant confidence, looking like a man in his late 30s who had long ago stopped expecting anything good from humanity. He bypassed the counter and sat at the secluded booth in the very back, right beside the window where the golden afternoon sun poured in, illuminating the stark contrast between his immaculate attire and the diner's worn interior. Lucy approached him with a freshly wiped menu and her signature genuine smile, welcoming him to the Maple Diner and asking if she could fetch him something to drink while he looked over the options. The stranger did not even bother to look up at her, keeping his dark eyes firmly locked on the glowing screen of his expensive smartphone, while curtly demanding a black coffee and a glass of water. Lucy was not offended by his dismissive tone. She had learned a long time ago that behind the abrasive shield of a difficult customer There was almost always a hidden weight, a bad day, or an invisible sorrow. She promptly returned with a steaming mug of coffee and the water, placing them gently on his table and softly letting him know she would be ready whenever he decided to order. The man finally lifted his gaze, and for just a brief, fleeting second, something in his cold expression seemed to completely halt as his eyes met her profound, bright green eyes, eyes that were far too sorrowful for someone so young. He quickly averted his gaze as if scolding himself for the distraction, then interrogated her with a dry, commanding tone, asking what she would recommend, treating the simple question more like a strict corporate examination than a polite inquiry. Lucy suggested the freshly baked meatloaf and the vegetable soup. Noting that the hot soup was incredibly comforting on such a breezy afternoon, but the man sharply retorted that he had not asked what she would eat. Any other waitress might have shrunk away or snapped back, but Lucy merely widened her gentle smile, gracefully apologizing and giving him a minute to decide, maintaining her perfect composure without a single crack. Watching from the kitchen window, Rose grumbled that the man had clearly come in looking for a fight, but Lucy softly defended him, insisting he was likely just an exhausted man, to which Rose argued that exhausted men did not wear $10,000 watches. The man eventually ordered the soup and the meatloaf, eating his meal in absolute silence while aggressively typing on his phone and taking hushed calls filled with harsh corporate terms about contracts, percentages, and refusing to accept less. Lucy glided back and forth, silently refilling his water glass, clearing away empty plates, and checking if everything was to his liking, consistently meeting his monosyllabic grunts and heavy silences with unwavering, professional warmth. Suddenly, her phone vibrated in her apron pocket. It was a frantic message from Carol stating that Matthew's fever had dangerously spiked again, causing Lucy's carefully constructed mask to momentarily shatter right behind the counter. The man in the black suit observed her brief tremble, the way she clutched the phone to her chest, closed her eyes to hold back tears, and then forced the brave smile back onto her face, prompting him to finally put his phone down and truly watch her. Lucy cleared the table after the man finally stood up, buttoned his tailored jacket, and walked out the door without uttering a single word of gratitude or saying goodbye. When she picked up the small black tray, she flipped over the receipt and felt the air completely vanish from her lungs as she stared at the tip line. Written in an elegant, incredibly firm handwriting, the man had penned $0, and right beneath that harsh number, he had boldly written the single word, sufficient. It was a brutal, physical blow, essentially telling her that she had already received enough of his time, that she was worthless, and that after 2 hours of flawless, attentive service, she deserved absolutely nothing. She felt a hot flush of deep humiliation rise to her cheeks, not entirely because of the missing money. Even though heaven knew she desperately needed every single cent to buy her child's medicine that week. The pain stemmed from the calculated, freezing cruelty of the gesture, the overwhelming realization that to this wealthy stranger, she was not a struggling human being, but merely a disposable object to be used and discarded. Hot tears threatened to spill from her beautiful green eyes, but she stubbornly blinked them away, absolutely refusing to break down and cry in the middle of the diner where everyone could see her fragile state. Rose poked her head out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, and immediately asked how much the wealthy businessman had left her, sensing the heavy shift in her young friend's demeanor. Lucy could not bring herself to speak at first, tightly clutching the crumpled receipt in her fist, but when Rose gently pressed her again, she softly whispered that he had left her nothing. Rose forcefully pried the paper from Lucy's trembling hand, her weathered face hardening in absolute fury as she read the insulting word, immediately threatening to march out into the parking lot and give the arrogant jerk a piece of her mind. Lucy quickly grabbed her arm, stopping her with a weary, grounded firmness, explaining that fighting with every cruel customer would leave her with absolutely nothing left to give to her sick son at home. "I have no energy for pride, Rose, only for surviving," she murmured softly, a heartbreaking truth delivered with such casual familiarity that it completely silenced the older woman's fiery rage and brought her in for a tight embrace. When Lucy finally unlocked the door to her tiny apartment late that night, she found Matthew tossing and turning in his small bed, his skin burning with a high fever, his chest emitting a terrifying high-pitched wheeze. Carol stood by with a worried, deeply sympathetic expression, explaining that she had tried cooling him down with damp cloths, but gently urging Lucy that the boy desperately needed a specialist in the city before his lungs gave out. Lucy knelt beside the small mattress, gently stroking her son's damp forehead, whispering promises she was terrified she could not keep, and for the first time in months, she let her silent tears fall freely in the dark. She pulled the crumpled, insulting receipt from her pocket, staring at the word sufficient under the dim yellow light, whispering to the empty room that the cruel stranger had no idea what that word actually meant. She nearly ripped the receipt into tiny shreds to throw it into the trash along with the memory of the cold man and his universe of expensive watches and hearts made of solid stone. Yet an inexplicable instinct forced her to stop. Her exhausted hands gently placed the piece of paper on the nightstand before she crawled into the narrow bed, holding her fiercely burning child close to her chest. She had absolutely no way of knowing that the harsh receipt was not the end of her encounter with the mysterious billionaire, but merely the bizarre prologue to an event that would turn her entire existence upside down. By the time her alarm rang loudly at 5 o'clock the next morning, Lucy had not slept a wink, having spent the entire night listening to her son's labored breathing and praying for a miracle. After leaving Matthew with Carol, promising to bring him a leftover slice of cake, she walked the 8 freezing blocks to the Maple Diner, the crisp morning air doing nothing to clear the heavy fog of fear in her mind. She turned on the lights, started the massive coffee machines, and began wiping down the tables left sticky from the previous night's closing shift, moving methodically until she reached the secluded back booth where the stranger had sat. When she lifted the cheap plastic vase, sitting in the center of the table, to wipe the laminate surface, she spotted something carefully folded and tucked underneath, completely hidden from anyone except the person thoroughly cleaning the booth. It was a piece of thick, creamy, incredibly expensive parchment paper, completely unlike the cheap, flimsy receipts they used at the diner, and she unfolded it slowly with trembling, calloused fingers. The message inside was written in the exact same elegant, firm handwriting from the day before, stating, "The real tip was not on the receipt. If you have the courage to find it, come to this address at 11 o'clock on Friday morning. Ask for Alexander Vance. What you saw as a humiliation was a test. You did not fail. Bring the boy if you wish." Below the cryptic message was an address located right in the heart of downtown Chicago, in the affluent financial district famous for towering glass skyscrapers and corporate power. Lucy read the impossible note 3 or 4 times, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, until Rose walked over, snatched the paper, and immediately warned her that it smelled like a dangerous trap set by a complete lunatic. Rose vividly reminded her of all the terrible news stories about wealthy men preying on poor women, begging Lucy to burn the note and forget the crazy billionaire who played twisted psychological games with exhausted waitresses. Lucy agreed out loud, shoving the note deep into her apron, but throughout her incredibly long shift, her mind kept returning to his chillingly accurate mention of her son, realizing the man had seen through her mask. She used a rare break to search the address on her phone, discovering that Alexander Vance was a renowned corporate magnate, a ruthless billionaire often dubbed the ICE executive by major financial magazines. Staring at the glaring photo of the cold man on her cracked screen, she thought of Matthew's terrifying wheeze and decided, right then, that she would walk straight into the lion's den if it meant even a fraction of a chance to save her little boy. At exactly 11:15 on Friday morning, Lucy stood frozen on the bustling Chicago sidewalk, staring up at the dizzying glass facade of Vance Enterprises, feeling her heart attempting to leap completely out of her chest. She had absolutely refused to bring Matthew along, leaving him safely in Carol's care, silently vowing that if this turned out to be a sinister trap, she would face the wealthy monster entirely on her own. Dressed in her only decent outfit, a faded blue dress she saved for parent-teacher conferences and rare important events, She felt profoundly out of place amidst the ocean of sleek briefcases, designer heels, and perfectly tailored suits. Taking 3 deep, shaky breaths to steady her trembling knees, she muttered a quiet prayer, pushed through the heavy revolving doors, and stepped into a sprawling lobby made of pristine white marble and soaring ceilings. The security guard eyed her with immediate suspicion, and the front desk receptionist asked how he could help with a tone of polite dismissal, clearly assuming the tired woman in the faded dress was terribly lost. When Lucy nervously cleared her dry throat and stated she had an 11:00 appointment with Mr. Alexander Vance, the receptionist raised a highly skeptical eyebrow, typing her name into the gleaming computer system with clear reluctance. To the receptionist's visible shock, her name flashed on the screen with maximum clearance, and he quickly summoned an executive assistant who escorted Lucy into a private, terrifyingly fast elevator that shot straight up to the 40th floor. The doors slid open to reveal a breathtaking corner office boasting floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire sprawling city, furnished with solid oak desks and leather-bound books, and standing by the glass with his hands in his pockets was Alexander. He turned around slowly, wearing a flawless gray suit, his sharp features just as cold as she remembered, though his dark eyes held a strange, new intensity as he softly confessed he was not entirely sure she would actually show up. He politely gestured for her to take a seat on the luxurious leather sofa, but Lucy remained rigidly standing, her posture defensive and her voice surprisingly steady as she declared she had no intention of staying long. Alexander studied her for a long moment, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow of a smile crossing his usually stone-like face, respecting her defiant boundaries as he leaned casually against the edge of his massive desk. Lucy decided to seize the moment, reaching into her worn handbag to pull out the crumpled diner receipt and the thick parchment note, slapping them both onto the polished oak desk with a resounding sharp thud. She unleashed the heavy burden of her anger, telling him exactly what she thought of his cruel stunt, explaining how deeply it stung to serve him flawlessly for 2 hours only to be degraded and mocked in front of her peers. Her voice shook with a potent mix of rage and sorrow as she demanded to know what a $40 tip meant to a billionaire and what kind of coward hides secret notes under plastic vases to play mind games with a desperate mother. She boldly demanded he state his business immediately, firmly reminding him that she had a critically ill child waiting for her at home and absolutely no time to indulge the twisted fantasies of a bored, affluent executive. She expected security to burst through the doors and drag her out for speaking to one of the city's most powerful men with such blazing disrespect, but Alexander simply listened in total silence, his expression softening into an unexpected look of deep admiration. "You have remarkable character, Miss Miller," he finally said, his voice low and devoid of its previous icy edge, stepping closer but maintaining a highly respectful distance from the visibly furious waitress standing in his office. He took a deep breath, revealing a profound exhaustion beneath his polished exterior, and explained that the lack of a tip was not an insult, but a highly deliberate, calculated test of human character. He gestured toward the sweeping city view, explaining that he spent every single day surrounded by hundreds of fake people, ambitious employees, and greedy partners who only smiled at him because they wanted a piece of his massive fortune. He confessed he had forgotten what genuine human sincerity looked like, so he spent the last week visiting humble establishments in disguise, acting like a completely miserable, demanding customer to see how people reacted when they believed there was no financial reward. He recounted how other servers had cursed at him, spat in his coffee, or chased him into the parking lot screaming insults the moment they realized he was not going to leave them a single shiny coin. "But you," Alexander said, his intense gaze locking onto her bright green eyes, "you maintained your grace, you treated me with unwavering warmth, and when your friend wanted to fight me, you chose quiet dignity over loud revenge." He walked behind his desk, opening a heavy drawer to pull out a thick white envelope, explaining that her ability to remain profoundly human while carrying the terrible weight of a sick child was a trait his billions could never buy. He held the envelope out to her, stating it contained the true, substantial tip her flawless service and incredible character had rightfully earned. That afternoon, hoping it would help ease the massive burden she carried alone. Lucy stared at the thick envelope, her mind racing with the realization of how many hospital bills that money could instantly vaporize. But a fierce, protective pride surged through her veins, forcing her to take a deliberate step backward. She firmly stated that she did not want his charity, nor did she want money earned by passing a twisted psychological test designed by a lonely, broken man who treated struggling people like laboratory rats. She choked back a sob, confessing the incredibly painful truth that she only came because her child was slowly suffocating, and she had foolishly hoped this bizarre encounter might yield a miracle cure, not a degrading social experiment. She delivered the final verbal blow, congratulating the isolated billionaire on finally finding a real person to validate his cynical worldview, asking bitterly if making a poor single mother cry finally made his hollow heart feel whole. Alexander dropped his hand, the envelope falling to the desk, and for the first time, the impenetrable ICE executive completely dropped his gaze, softly whispering that he did not feel better. He felt profoundly, deeply ashamed. Lucy picked up the hidden note from the desk, telling him she was leaving and returning his ridiculous game pieces. But as she reached the heavy wooden door, Alexander called out, his voice cracking with a sudden, raw vulnerability. He asked exactly what was wrong with her son, and when Lucy defensively demanded to know why he cared, Alexander confessed that he, too, was once a terrified, desperately poor child whose father could not afford a doctor. He vividly described the exact, haunting sound a desperate mother makes when she realizes she cannot afford to save her child's life, leaving Lucy frozen in the doorway, completely torn between her protective distrust and the agonizing hope blooming in her chest. 3 full days passed without a single word from the billionaire, and Lucy threw herself back into the exhausting rhythm of her double shifts, convinced that her fiery outburst in his office had permanently severed their bizarre connection. Rose, the seasoned cook, constantly reassured Lucy that she had done the exact right thing by rejecting the insane billionaire's money, insisting that wealthy, sorrowful men were the most dangerous traps a poor woman could ever fall into. Still, no matter how vigorously she scrubbed the diner's countertops, Lucy could not shake the haunting sincerity in Alexander's voice when he spoke about being a poor child, realizing his pain felt entirely too authentic to be a fabricated corporate lie. On the afternoon of the 4th day, a completely silent, gleaming black luxury car smoothly pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Maple Diner, immediately drawing the stunned stares of every single customer eating their pie. Alexander Vance stepped out of the back seat, looking just as impeccably dressed as before, and pushed through the glass doors, the little bell chiming as he confidently walked straight to the secluded back booth. Lucy felt the blood rush violently to her cheeks, momentarily considering begging another waitress to cover his table, but her stubborn courage won out, and she approached him with a menu, her voice barely a whisper as she asked if he was done playing games. He looked up, his dark eyes entirely devoid of their usual corporate armor, and solemnly swore he was done with tests, asking only for 10 minutes of her time the moment her shift ended at 4 o'clock. He promised that if she refused to come outside, he would drive away and absolutely never bother her family again, leaving Lucy to nervously stare at him before offering a slow, hesitant nod of agreement. When 4 o'clock finally arrived, Lucy untied her apron and walked out into the chilly afternoon air, finding Alexander leaning patiently against the hood of his car, holding the passenger door open for her with respectful courtesy. He asked if she would mind taking a short drive to a place that wasn't very far, assuring her she could text his license plate number to her fiercely protective friend in the kitchen if it made her feel safer. Lucy, who had already given Rose the plate numbers with strict instructions to call the police if she vanished, slid into the plush leather seat, enveloped by the strange, quiet luxury of a vehicle worth more than her entire life's earnings. They drove in complete silence, away from the towering skyscrapers of Chicago, heading deep into a forgotten, incredibly humble suburb characterized by cracked sidewalks, peeling paint, and clotheslines strung between narrow, cramped windows. He parked the expensive car in front of a particularly tiny, dilapidated house, turning the engine off and staring at the rotting front porch with a look of profound, heavy nostalgia, quietly revealing that this was the house where he grew up. He painted a vivid picture of his childhood, explaining that his father was an exhausted factory worker and his mother washed clothes for pennies, making them truly, desperately poor, the kind of poor where every single slice of bread was mathematically calculated. When he was 8 years old, his little sister, Annie, developed a severe, fatal heart condition that required a specialized, incredibly expensive surgery that his struggling parents could never dream of affording on their own. He described how his proud parents begged, borrowed, and humiliated themselves before the wealthy elites of the city, only to be looked upon with the exact same disgust and contempt that Lucy had originally assumed he held for her. Little Annie died when she was exactly 6 years old, the very same age Matthew was right now, an agonizing tragedy that completely shattered his father, who died of a broken heart just a few short years later. Alexander tightly gripped the leather steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white as he confessed he made 2 solemn vows at his sister's tiny grave to become impossibly wealthy and to ensure no other poor child ever died for lacking pieces of green paper. He succeeded brilliantly at the first promise, building a massive empire by his mid-30s, but the infectious greed of the corporate world slowly hardened his soul, causing him to completely forget the second, most important promise he had ever made. He turned to Lucy with tears shining in his dark eyes, admitting he created the cruel diner tests to find a genuinely good person who could wake him up from his toxic, money-obsessed nightmare and remind him how to feel. He told her that her unyielding grace in the face of his calculated cruelty proved that true, selfless goodness still existed, and he absolutely refused to let her beautiful boy suffer the same tragic fate as his beloved sister Annie. The heavy silence inside the car was thick with raw, unresolved grief until Lucy finally spoke, her voice trembling as she stated she could not accept his money because wealthy men always eventually demanded something terrible in return. Alexander completely understood her fierce maternal distrust, offering a brilliant compromise. He asked her to simply let a top-tier medical specialist examine Matthew entirely free of charge, with absolutely zero strings attached, and if she wanted to disappear afterward, he would let her go. He cornered her with the one argument she could not fight, softly asking if a loving mother could truly let her fierce pride deny her suffocating child a life-saving medical consultation, breaking down her final walls of defense. The very next morning, an elegant town car collected Lucy and a wide-eyed Matthew, transporting them to a pristine private medical facility completely devoid of the chaotic, crowded waiting rooms they usually endured for hours on end. Alexander intentionally stayed away to honor his promise of zero pressure, but he had arranged for Dr. Harrison, the finest pediatric lung specialist in the entire state, to examine the boy with incredible gentleness and state-of-the-art equipment. After extensive testing, the doctor brought Lucy into his office, delivering the bittersweet news that Matthew had a chronic condition that was destroying his lungs, but it was entirely curable with an intense, prolonged, and astronomically expensive treatment plan. Lucy left the clinic clutching her son's small hand, her soul completely crushed by the devastating knowledge that her child's salvation actually existed, but it was locked behind a financial wall she could never, ever hope to climb. Later that afternoon, Alexander summoned a weeping Lucy back to the 40th floor, where he sat alongside his corporate lawyer, offering her a fully legitimate, high-paying contract to manage his newly established charitable medical foundation for underprivileged children. He explained that her profound empathy and lived experience made her the perfect director, and the job included an elite medical benefits package that would immediately cover every single penny of Matthew's expensive lung treatments. Before she could process the magnitude of the miracle, she rushed home to find Matthew turning blue, violently gasping for air in a massive, life-threatening asthma attack that caused her entire world to completely stop spinning. She frantically dialed Alexander's number in sheer terror, and the billionaire raced across the city faster than the ambulance. Arriving with Dr. Harrison in tow, personally carrying the gasping boy into the emergency vehicle and saving his life that very night. Following that terrifying night in the hospital, where Alexander sat quietly in a hard plastic chair until the sun came up, Lucy signed the employment contract with tears of immense gratitude streaming down her face. She bid a highly emotional farewell to the Maple Diner, receiving a massive, tearful hug from Rose, and quickly moved her son into a modest but incredibly clean, dust-free apartment closer to the new foundation's headquarters. Matthew's health improved almost immediately under the new medical protocol. The haunting midnight wheezing completely vanished, replaced by the joyful, chaotic laughter of a little boy, finally experiencing the boundless energy of a normal childhood. Lucy threw her entire heart into her new role as the Foundation's director, using her deep understanding of poverty to comfort terrified parents, quickly proving to be an exceptionally brilliant and compassionate administrator. Lucy and Alexander began spending countless hours together, transitioning from strictly professional discussions over Foundation spreadsheets to sharing late-night dinners, where they talked about their deepest fears, shattered dreams, and the heavy emotional scars they both carried. The towering walls Lucy had built around her heart to survive her cruel life slowly began to crumble piece by piece, as she realized the intimidating ICE executive was actually a profoundly gentle, deeply wounded man who adored her son. However, true happiness rarely goes unnoticed by those who thrive in misery, and Rachel, Alexander's incredibly bitter and vindictive ex-wife, had spotted the couple laughing intimately during a quiet dinner at a secluded downtown restaurant. Enraged that a lowly former waitress was replacing her, Rachel allied herself with Frank, a resentful former business partner of Alexander's, and the two viciously wealthy socialites began plotting to completely obliterate Lucy's reputation. Rachel launched a ruthless smear campaign, using her vast connections to feed highly toxic rumors to the city's elite, whispering that the new Foundation director was a manipulative gold digger who used her sick child as a calculated trap to steal a billionaire. She paid corrupt journalists to publish invasive photographs of Lucy exiting Alexander's luxury vehicles, splashing venomous headlines across gossip magazines that painted the struggling single mother as a highly deceitful, opportunistic predator climbing the corporate ladder. The devastating rumors quickly spread, causing wealthy donors to question the Foundation's integrity, and eventually pushing the corporate board of directors to demand an emergency meeting to discuss the massive reputational risk Lucy posed to the massive Vance empire. Crushed by the overwhelming public humiliation and terrified of destroying Alexander's life's work, Lucy drafted a formal letter of resignation, fully prepared to sacrifice her own happiness and vanish into obscurity to protect the man she loved. She walked into the imposing boardroom clutching the crumpled resignation letter, finding the long table filled with stern executives, Alexander sitting at the head, and Rachel lounging in the corner with a highly venomous, triumphant smirk on her face. A senior director cleared his throat, harshly suggesting that employing a completely uneducated former diner waitress with a scandalous public image was incredibly dangerous for the company's stock, demanding her immediate removal from the charitable foundation. Before Lucy could surrender her letter and run away, Alexander slowly stood up, his towering presence commanding absolute silence, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, protective fury that made the entire room collectively hold its breath. He stared directly at his smug ex-wife, publicly revealing that his investigators had already traced every single bribe, fake photograph, and vicious rumor directly back to her and Frank, promising entirely ruinous legal consequences for their slander. Alexander then turned his passionate gaze toward Lucy, boldly declaring to the stunned executives that she was the most profoundly honest, incredibly brave human being he had ever met, and anyone who disrespected her would have to go through him. The boardroom erupted into chaotic whispers as Rachel turned ash white, her malicious plan completely backfiring, while Lucy realized with overwhelming clarity that she was no longer fighting her battles alone. She finally had a true champion. Later that same evening, Alexander invited a highly emotional Lucy to his grand, incredibly warm mansion, gently taking the torn resignation letter from her trembling hands and tossing it directly into the crackling fireplace. As he guided her through the quiet, spacious halls lined with old memories, Lucy paused abruptly before a faded, black-and-white photograph resting on a mahogany shelf depicting a poor family with a young boy and a little girl. Lucy was stunned to discover that the oak tree locket worn by Alexander's father in an old photograph was identical to the one her late father, Thomas Miller, had treasured throughout his life. Alexander revealed that Thomas had been his father's closest friend and had sacrificed his own possessions to help pay for little Annie's heart surgery decades earlier. The matching lockets had been carved as symbols of their friendship before the families lost contact. Realizing that their father's bond had unknowingly connected them across generations, Lucy and Alexander embraced their shared history. However, their happiness was threatened when Rachel launched a malicious campaign against Lucy, fabricating evidence and false witness statements to accuse her of neglecting Matthew. The resulting legal battle caused immense stress, even leading to a minor relapse in Matthew's health. When Rachel attempted to bribe Lucy into disappearing with cash and plane tickets, Lucy rejected the offer, drawing strength from her father's integrity and refusing to sacrifice her dignity or abandon her son. At the court hearing, Alexander's attorney exposed Rachel's bribery scheme and fabricated accusations, while Dr. Harrison testified that Lucy was an exceptionally devoted mother and that Matthew's condition was part of a normal recovery process. The judge dismissed the case, ordered criminal investigations into Rachel and Frank, and brought about their complete downfall. In the years that followed, the medical foundation flourished, helping hundreds of children, while Alexander and Lucy married in a simple ceremony beneath an oak tree. Matthew grew into a healthy, energetic child, and the two families' oak lockets were united on a single chain, honoring a promise made by their fathers long ago. Later, with their daughter Hope completing the family, Lucy and Alexander found lasting happiness and purpose. Their story proves that integrity, courage, and compassion are worth more than wealth or status, and that those who remain true to their values through hardship often discover that even the greatest trials can lead them to the life they were meant to live.